Do you ever wish you could do a quick, brisk, freehand drawing of a fairly complex scene, maybe even a complex interior scene? Look, this drawing took me just under 2 hours to do. Every drawing is still just line by line. Let me talk you through how I did this, and maybe it can give you some encouragement to give it a go yourself. I mean, what have any of us got to lose by trying? Okay, so let me explain how I stepped through this. G'day, I'm Travers. In some ways, there's nothing more complex about a complex scene than a simple scene, except there's just more of it. But really, all the same principles are applied. However, with a complex scene, particularly one we're going to draw freehand, and particularly with ink where we get no second chances with our lines, it's important to really consider our reference, whether it's a photo or whether it's in front of us, just to plan the best way that we can draw this scene with our own technique and drawing style of mapping out our subject to keep it as accurate as possible and to be able to achieve whatever stylistic elements we like to do. So let's have a look at the reference. So here we have a ground floor view of the magnificent royal chapel in the Palace of Versailles. The most important thing is to work out where to start, and is to choose a spot where we can establish the proportions fairly accurately and then move outwards from there. And in this case, I think it's quite straightforward that this is the section to start with because it's a nice central location. We can then move down and up fairly accurately and then move out. The other thing we need to do when working from a photo is to work out whether we want to draw the distortion that the lens produces, where in an effort to pull more of the scene into the image being captured, it actually creates this distortion effect where vertical lines start to slope. Now often it has a wonderful dramatic sense, but in this case I think I'm actually going to eliminate it as I draw. So instead of drawing these angles, I'm going to draw the more straight verticals. So let's start. It's important to note that this is not a completely symmetrical view, almost, but the angles of the left and right hand side galleries and entablatures are not the same. So we need to make sure we capture that. Now I spend more time drawing these two columns at the back center than anything else in the drawing, ironically, even though they look simple, because I want to really try and get the proportions correct, the ratio of the thickness of the columns to the space between them. It's hard to do when the detail that's between the columns isn't there because it looks a bit different when it's all blank. And so for that reason, I will actually put more detail in around these columns than I would normally do at this stage of a drawing, because it will help me just work out that I've got things looking correct. And if they're not quite correct, then possibly if I find that out now, I can make some adjustments as I continue the rest of the drawing. I'm also not going to worry about the shade, even though it's tempting to put some hatching lines in up the back where all these lovely dark shadows are, because it's easier to get a nice consistent working of tone over the whole thing with hatching. If we do it all at once, we can keep our values relative to each other more accurately if we do it all in one go. So now I'm working on the pipe organ up the back here. I just want to suggest the detail of the decoration of this organ. I'm not trying to draw anything exactly the same. I'm certainly not trying to draw little angels and things. I'm just trying to draw a few odd lines that could suggest an angel, because at this distance it's the effect we need, not the exactness. We don't actually see the details in life in any obvious way at this point. So I'm going to use what I've drawn as my reference to get alignment for a lot of what I now draw, particularly with this lower arcade. Now these arcade supports line up with the columns, so I'm trying to make sure I do that as much as I can. And I also need to establish where the floor is going to be, where this final step is. I placed it too low originally, but it's going to be easy enough just to make that adjustment. I don't want to leave it in the wrong place, because then it will throw out the whole sense of perspective. If I do, always put the correct line in if we've made a wrong one. We can often hide the wrong one, as I will here. I love these very tall candles on the altar at the end. So I want to make sure that they can still be seen as one of the very few bits of detail I will accurately represent. Again, you can see how I'm not drawing the detail exactly. I'm just suggesting I want to draw things that look as though they could be sculptures of figures. Symmetrical objects such as these two chandeliers, always draw them at the same time to make sure they are truly symmetrical, and also just simply have the same shape. Again, I'm not drawing a light, I'm just copying these little geometric shapes that are stacked on each other. Look at the way I get these angles right for the perspective. I use my pen to measure, and this works if you're drawing on location as well. You can just hold it up in front of your eyes, get the angle lined up with the object, and then bring it straight down onto the paper. It is surprisingly accurate. Now, it's a bit tricky with this spot because I'm correcting the lens distortion. I'm not drawing exactly what we're seeing in the reference photo. But at this point, I'm doing this little apse ceiling up the far end, this semicircular roof. And again, I'm not happy with this curve on the right-hand side, so I put the right line in, and I think I'm able to hide that mistake fairly happily. A mistake will usually be more obvious than a corrected line. Now, I also need to establish where the upper limit will be of this part of the drawing. So again, with this fresco painting on the ceiling, I'm just suggesting the scene. I'm not trying to draw figures. I could never do that on this scale. Little circles for little heads. It's important to get the scale correct, but otherwise we're just doing a few shapes that would suggest legs or arms. And when I put the hatching in, I'll try and bring that together more, but I need to resist the urge to worry about that just yet. So now I get this top upper lining, which is actually the underneath of the arcade above, curving around. One of the great things about any drawing, but particularly in a complex drawing, is how it really does get quicker the more we do, even when it's not sped up, as in this video. So I established the very top line here because I've got an idea of what sort of hatching I need to do up there. Now I position the arcade columns underneath the upper level colonnade and position these arches, starting to think about the spaces between the columns now. Again, because I'm not copying the photo, I've got to make some adjustments and some allowances for the fact that things aren't going to line up. So once again, I'm suggesting what's there and doing some sort of representation which can at least look realistic, even if it's not exactly what would be there if we were drawing this on location. And so get now some of the detail, some of the figure work. It's important with these figures and with the decorative work that are on these columns, because of the perspective, we need to actually incorporate the perspective into how we draw the figures, the shields and the floral work that appear as decorative elements. They need to reflect the perspective that they're being shown from. Now, there's also a fair bit of detail on the underneath of this arcade, that's the upper surface, and I need to suggest that I don't need to do it in any great detail. It is actually very detailed, but I just want to do a few swirls and garlands at an appropriate scale. We can see now how the angle separating the upper and lower arcades on the left-hand side is actually a steeper angle than on the right-hand side. They're the sorts of details that's important to notice, and not just to start drawing the left-hand side as a copy using our muscle memory, because that will just get us into grief. Again, trying to align the upper and lower supports is a bit tricky because of the differences I'm making. I become very loose, very gestural now in this final part of the detail that I'm drawing, which is something that I enjoy, and I think it works quite well to have a focus of the drawing, in this case the far end, in perhaps you could call it a tighter detail. And then as we move out, we get a looser, much more gestural approach style to our drawing, which often reflects the way when we look at a scene, we see one part in detail and less detail with the parts further out from that particular space we're looking at. So once I've got all this line work done now, I can then start to consider the hatching. Now comes the hatching. I do have a number of videos that deal with this, but this is also an excellent example, I think, to see some of the possibilities of hatching and cross-hatching. The important thing is to use this as an opportunity to make clearer the actual structure that we're looking at, the parts that sit in front of other parts where the light is coming from. So I'm not so concerned about following exactly the reference photo, but I want to create clarity in what is a very busy drawing. There are lots of lines, so if I'm going to add even more lines, I don't want to use them to confuse what's happening even more. An important thing with hatching is to try and reflect the form of the object that the hatching is over the top of, and you can see me doing that in different ways with hatching lines going in different directions. And the important thing with the tone that we're trying to correct, or the tone effect that we're trying to create with our lines, is that it's all relative to the other tones. And so it is useful to keep working back and forth across the whole drawing. And to, when we finished a part, to look and to think, is this dark enough compared to areas I've already done? Or should I make it a bit darker? Again, it's important to realize that because the light is coming through from the right-hand side, that the lighting is different on the right side arcade to the left side arcade. I'm also now using the hatching to complete this painting on the ceiling up the end here. And so I'm using the hatching both for the actual darker colours of the painting, but also for the greater degree of shade, which is on the right-hand side of it. And now I'm putting the hatching on this overhanging section of the arcade above that frames the top of our drawing. And one thing I've done is I've drawn a number of these lines from left to right to act as guides for when I do all the lines, because as you can see, I'm wanting these lines to in some way reflect the perspective changes that happens from left to right. Now it's a case of making final adjustments, particularly pushing those areas that we want to be darkest. You can see I've really put no lines to indicate shadow on the columns, even though they are there in the reference photo. And look, I probably should have made that shadow on the extreme left-hand side of our drawing behind that first arcade darker. I'm not really happy with the way those lines work. It's always good to critique our drawing and work out what will I do next time differently. But look, what do you think? Why not give it a go yourself? Find a subject that's difficult and discover that perhaps it's not as difficult as you think. All the best.